Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Great to have you guys here today as we continue this series called You'll Be Glad You Did. And throughout this series, we're talking about certain decisions we can make at certain phases of life so that in a future phase of life, we can look back and say, man, I'm so glad I did, rather than saying, I wish I had. And today is really a continuation of last week's message. This is like part 2 of a continuing conversation. And if you were here last week, you know that last week we talked about the importance of investing in the next generation. We talked about parenting, but not just parenting. We broadened that to talk about our collective responsibility as a church to shape and mold the hearts of the next generation. I want to continue that conversation today, but I want to begin with a story. I don't know if this story is true or not. I couldn't verify it, so I can't vouch for it. But this goes back almost 30 years ago to the shipwreck and the oil spill that happened just off the coast of Alaska. And the story goes like this. After the Exxon Valdez oil spill, an enormous amount of money had to be spent cleaning up the environment and rehabilitating the wildlife. About 6 months after the accident, 2 seals were released back into the ocean after being cleaned up and restored to full health. The cost of rehabilitating the 2 seals was over $80,000. A special ceremony was held, a crowd gathered on the beach, and the animals were set free to the sounds of clapping and cheering. A few minutes later, the crowd watched in shocked surprise as the 2 seals were attacked and eaten by a killer whale. Circle of life. Again, I don't know if that's true or not, but I read that because to me, that's an illustration of one of my greatest fears when it comes to parenting. That I'm going to invest 18 years in my kids or more, and I'm going to train them up, and I'm going to love them, and I'm going to disciple them, and I'm going to shape their hearts, but then I've got to send them out into the world, out into a world that could destroy them morally and spiritually. And so here's the tension we wrestle with, and here's the question that all of us, parents or not, have to ask ourselves. How can we raise a generation of young people who will make a difference in this world without being shaped by this world? In other words, how can we send out young men and women into this world who are going to be difference makers, who are going to be the hands and feet of Christ, who are going to be light in the darkness, but not have this world and its values infiltrate their hearts and co-opt their minds and change them and shape them? And I want to talk about this question for a little while, and then toward the end of our time, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to bring some parents up here on the platform and have about a 20-minute Q&A panel with some actual parents, because sometimes what we just need to hear are some real-life answers from real people who are doing this, because sometimes the best teacher is someone else's experience. So we've got some questions prepared for the panel, but we also want to hear your questions if you have them, questions related to, parenting or investing in the next generation if you're not a parent. And so just pick out the number that corresponds with your campus, and you can start right now texting questions as they come to mind to that number. And if you don't get the number jotted down, it'll come up again later. Maybe you can jot down a question as it comes to you. And just one added incentive, in every service we'll be giving away a resource to someone who asks a question, a great book on parenting called Grace-Based Parenting. Okay, so here's the question we're wrestling with today. How can we raise a generation of young people who will make a difference in this world without being shaped by this world? And I want to try to answer this question from the words of Jesus himself in John chapter 17. And these 5 verses that I'm about to read aren't really verses on parenting at all, which is kind of good because not all of you are parents. So even if you're not a parent, there are some just really powerful principles here that we're going to be talking about that apply to any of us who are Christ followers seeking to live out our faith in this world. So here's the background. Jesus spoke these words on the night before he would go to a cross and be crucified. He's spending a few final hours with his closest followers, his disciples, and he speaks these words that are actually a prayer. He's actually praying for them. And just listen as I read. Here's what he said. I've given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. And so he's praying this prayer. Now remember, Jesus had spent 3 years with these guys. 3 years of investing in them and teaching them and preparing them. But now he was about to leave this world and they would be on their own. And as I was reading this, I thought, man, there's a connection here with parenting. Because every parent feels this tension. You know, you invest years and years in training your kids, and then one day you send them out, right? You move them into a new apartment, you drop them off at college, you walk them down the aisle, you wave as they drive out of the driveway for that last time. And when you get to that moment when you're sending them off, what you hope is you hope that your son or daughter remembers everything that you taught them in those 18, 20, 25, hopefully not 30 years that they were, in your home. And I think Jesus felt like that. He had invested all of himself in this little band of followers, and now he was about to leave them on their own. And so he does the most important thing he could do. He prays for them. And here's how that prayer begins. I've given them your word, and the world has hated them. For they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. And so he begins simply by acknowledging that these guys would be carrying on in a world where they would have to swim upstream, that they would be living in a world that would be hostile to their faith and their values. And again, I think every parent can identify with this because we're raising our kids today. We're raising the next generation collectively as a community of believers. We're raising them in a world that will do its best to undermine their faith and their values. In my personal opinion, it's never been more difficult to parent than it is today. I mean, we live in a world where our kids are just a few keystrokes away from thousands of pornographic websites. We live in a world every day where my 2 daughters are told in 100 different ways by 100 different voices that their value is based on their physical appearance. We live in a world today where our kids can make just a couple wrong decisions and they can be HIV positive or they can be drug addicted. I mean, we live in a world that's working 24/7 against our efforts to raise a generation of committed Christ followers. That is the world in which we live. So what are we going to do about that? As parents, as individuals? I think we can go to one of two extremes. As parents and personally, we can do this. One extreme is this, it's isolation. We can just try to completely isolate ourselves and isolate our families from the influence of this world, try to create this little perfectly safe world for them. If you're my age, you might remember a story back in the 1970s about a little boy named David Vedder. And David Vedder was born with a medical condition that left him literally with no immune system. And back in 1971, when he was born, there was no medical treatment for this. Most kids with his condition would die within weeks. But his parents and his doctors decided to keep him alive by placing him inside of a sterile plastic bubble that was designed actually by NASA. And so David spent every moment of his life inside this bubble, inside this controlled environment. No physical contact with anyone in the outside world, but even that wasn't enough because he became ill and he passed away at the age of just 12 years old. And I thought that that's a picture of sometimes how we as Christians try to live in this world. We just try to isolate ourselves and create our own little world within the rest of the world. But that doesn't really work for very long because guess what? Eventually our kids grow up and they get driver's licenses and they have friends and they go off to college and they move out. And if we try to completely isolate them, actually what we do is we undermine their spiritual growth. I mean, I've seen so many kids who grow up in Christian homes and then they walk onto a college campus and they're blown away morally and spiritually because they just never had to wrestle with what they believe and why they believe it. And so isolation, that's one extreme. The other extreme that we can go to personally or with our kids is just indifference. Indifference to the power of the influence of this culture around us. And with parenting, this is when we step back and we say, you know, I'm just going to let my kids do whatever they feel like doing. It's when I say, you know what, it's no big deal. It's just a movie. It's just a website. It's just one beer. It's probably not going to hurt them. It's just what kids their age do. And in our indifference, what we can do is we can open up the hearts of our kids to the influence of the evil one who can completely undermine everything that we want for them. So you've got these two extremes that we can go to as we live in this very broken world. We can be indifferent to the influences of our culture, or we can try to isolate ourselves from it. But let me give you a better option, because Jesus, he continues praying. And he says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, that you isolate them, but that you protect them from the evil one, not be indifferent to the forces of evil that are loose in this world. So Jesus prays, and what he prays for his disciples and for us is that we would be in this world, engaged in this world, but not shaped by this world. And we should want the same thing. All of us, for the next generation. We should want to raise up a generation of young people who will be difference makers in this world, who will shine the light in the darkness, but who will not be overcome by the darkness of this world. How does that happen? Keep reading verse 17. Sanctify them, Jesus prayed. Sanctify simply means this, to be set apart for a special purpose. He's praying that his followers would be unique. They would be distinct in this world. And this idea of being sanctified, that's actually an idea you might be familiar with. Like when I was growing up, my mom actually had sanctified dishes. They were like the everyday dishes. Then there was the china in the cabinet that was set aside for a special purpose, only came out when important company was there. I actually had sanctified shoes. We had our everyday shoes. Then we had what my mom called Sunday shoes, set apart for a special purpose. Some of you guys, you have sanctified cars. That's the one you never drive in the winter, stays in the garage. Your wife has never been behind the wheel of that thing. That's your car that's set apart for a special purpose. Jesus says, I want my followers to be set aside for a holy, noble purpose in this world. And how are they sanctified or set apart? By the truth. Your word is truth. So instead of choosing isolation or indifference, let me give you a third option, what I would call inoculation. Inoculation is when you go to the doctor and they inject you with a vaccine so that you can be kept from getting a disease. Sometimes you get one of these when you're planning to travel to a country where certain diseases are common. So before you go, you get an inoculation to protect you and allow you to go to a place that otherwise would be dangerous for you. Can I tell you what our job is as a church and specifically as parents? To inoculate our kids against the deception they're going to face in this world. And how do we do that? By giving them regular injections of truth. Like you go out to a movie with them, and then after the movie you talk about the theme, the plot of that movie, and how it lines up with truth or falsehood. You listen to the music they're listening to. And then you have a conversation about the worldview that's reflected in that music. You talk about current events and what those current events say about the heart of mankind. It's just every day in conversation, helping our kids to come to terms with what they believe and why they believe it, so that when they grow up and when they leave home, they have developed moral and spiritual standards that they own for themselves, and that they can articulate the reason behind them when challenged. And here's why it's so important. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. Because as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. Jesus was about to send his followers, his disciples, into the world with the most important message that history had ever heard. And they needed to be prepared, set apart, have the truth in their hearts. And see, this is what we do as parents. This is what we're called to do as a church. We raise up a generation that will be unique, that will be different, that will be sent into this world to make an impact. If I could summarize parenting very simply, this is the goal of parenting, to set them up for the day when we send them off. I love these words from the book, Parenting Beyond Your Capacity. It says, the mission of the family is not ultimately to protect your children, but to mobilize them to demonstrate God's love to a broken world. It's possible to hang on to our kids so tightly that we forget the ultimate goal of parenting is letting go. We're fine if our children never climb a mountain as long as it guarantees they never get hurt. But what if your children were made for the mountains? My older daughter, right after high school, she decided that she wanted to spend a year serving God in the country of South Africa. This is a picture from the year that she was there. Some of you have heard me talk about this. And I remember as she was preparing to go on this trip, I was supportive of her, but I was also a little bit afraid. She was going to spend a year in South Africa, a country with one of the highest crime rates in the world, a country where 1 out of every 5 adults was HIV positive. And I remember telling people about her plans, and almost without exception, the reaction would be, wow, I would never let my daughter do that. And I remember every time hearing that, the fear would rise up in my heart. And at times, I just had to stop and pray. And I just had to remind myself that this is the whole point of parenting for Christians. This is the goal of parenting, to set them up for the day we send them out. God doesn't give us kids to accessorize our lives. He gives us kids so that we can send living messages to a time that we will not see. We set them up for the day we send them out. Very quickly, let me just mention a great opportunity to set your kids up really well. We offer opportunities for summer camp experiences. And I'll tell you, in my life, summer camp was one of the most formative experiences of my growing up years. Our high school opportunity is filled, but there are 2 opportunities coming up in July for students 6th through 8th grade and 4th and 5th grades. And one of the greatest gifts I believe you can give to your kids is to give them a week at a camp that will help them to understand their faith and what it means to live like a follower of Christ. All the information on parkerhillfamily.org/WO Word of Life camps.